Delighted to have you, Ranjit, on our program. This is the second of the series that we are holding, Conversations with Eminent Poet. And we are very fortunate that the inaugural program that we had of conversation was with Christopher Merrill. And this is the second in the series, and I'm equally delighted to have Ranjit Hoskote with us. Welcome, Ranjit, to our program. I look forward to this conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Sukrita and Vinita. It's a great pleasure to be in conversation with you about this wonderful endeavor.
Thank you. We want as much encouragement as possible because this was a very, very big challenge. Because I think it was thanks to some of you who very readily got admitted into the whole process of selection. So maybe we should have a discussion on the entire. We can talk a little bit about the process as well as to how the selection happened. But to start with, I think it's important to focus on one or two other points, which we need to ask this question: why has the year? You might say, all right, why don't we answer that question? But Vinita, would you like to start off the conversation on why the yearbook, and then Ranjit can take over?
So I don't want to give the answer to that. I would just like to phrase the question again and just say and just ask Ranjit that Ranjit, this was an endeavor to bring under one umbrella the Indian diaspora, Indians living in India and abroad, and to put together quality poetry that they've written in a given year. So do you think, you must have gone through the yearbook, and do you think that this endeavor has been met, and do you think that we have been able to sort of bring under in one anthology what the Indians have been writing in a year?
First of all, let me congratulate both of you on this marvelous endeavor. I mean, I've been reading it, I've been revisiting specific poems, and I've been struck by the diversity of the poems and the locations that the poets come from. So let me put it this way. I think the yearbook sits very well in a larger family of anthologies. And it also makes up for a certain necessary deficit that you have when there's just one periodic anthology that might appear once in 10 years or 20 years. This is a good way of mapping and assessing the scene as it vibrantly is. And since you plan to make it a yearbook, like all great series of yearbooks, it'll be a way of really benchmarking the Anglophone poetry in India scene. And I think that there are marvelous precedents, for instance. I mean, learned societies have yearbooks. In our own context, in the same domain, I remember H.K. Kaur, who unfortunately is no longer with us, the Poetry Society of India, when it had its annual competition in collaboration with the British Council, that was effectively a kind of, I mean, it had a different selection process. It came out long lists and winning entries for the annual competition. You have a different methodology, which is necessarily rigorous and forward with much hope to your series of yearbooks.
Thank you. Ranjit, I personally feel that, I don't know what you would have to say about this, but I personally feel, and Vinita sort of might agree with me, that there has been adequate critical attention given to Indian writing in English. More focus has been there on fiction, but not so much on poetry. And I think it's time that we were to, basically assess the sense of tradition that might have evolved in the writing of poetry in English, in India and abroad, of course. And so we've been thinking about this, that if we were to identify this tradition, I think the yearbook would be one of the pointers to the building of a certain kind of sense of tradition, the way Indian poetry is happening in India.
I think it would be a good way of mapping both continuity and ruptures. Because I think the question of whether Anglophone poetry in India has a tradition or not, that debate has been constantly with us for over a century at least. I know it was a matter of great anxiety, for instance, to the three major anthologies between the 70s and the early 2000s. I'm thinking of 10 20th century Indian poets, which was the anthology that came out in 1976, if I remember correctly. And there it was very much a question of, one's tongue in English chains and so on. The Parthasarathi motif was very strong.
Yes.
But then there were a couple of other anthologies along the way. And in 1992, if I remember correctly, Arvind Mehrotra put out 12 modern Indian poets. But in each of these, I think there was, for one, there was a desire to produce a kind of a selective canon. And at the same time, there was an ongoing anxiety about the location of English. What was the sort of tradition that one looked back to? And when exactly does that begin? With all of the anxieties of modernism layered onto that, I think we are now very far away from that set of concerns. For one thing, all the anthologies that have emerged in the last 2 decades have been copious and capacious. They really open up the sphere. They embrace more theaters of cultural activity and writing than did these canonical ones. So I think the accent and emphasis now is much less on canon formation and much more on, in fact, being capacious and looking at the diversity of voices and practices. So this is a big move. And I think we learn much more about an evolving tradition in the second kind of anthology. Honestly, because then you see how people have drawn on exemplars and inspirations within the tradition of Anglophone poetry in India, but also how many of these voices are more plural, what they respond to, how they frame their genealogies, to use our well-worn but still very handy idea of Eliot's, the tradition and the individual talent. I mean, as individual poets, we all frame our own genealogies, traditions that we belong to and where we feel at home. And for many generations now in Anglophone poetry, this has come from diverse sources. People have drawn on translation, they've drawn on other literatures in India. Equally, they've drawn on poetry in translation. They've been inspired by work in America, Eastern Europe. So to my mind, this is what really a yearbook will bear witness to and why it's important. So in general, I'm a little suspicious of tight canons. I myself have been a great votary of canons in the past, but I find them less and less useful now. The canon formation story to one side, but I think that still leaves open notions of criteria and how one makes the choices and inclusions that one does.
And also, I think there has been a sociological change in the context of, the social media coming up, and, there's Twitter poetry. I won't say Twitter poetry, I'm particularly referring to it with you in mind, but that's not just limited to Twitter and not kind of making fun of it, but it's serious poetry, which is coming on Twitter. There is serious poetry coming on social media in general and Facebook. But there is a plethora of writers who are writing today. But that also presents a certain kind of a problem. How do you sift poetry from non-poetry? Or do we need to do that at all? And if we are doing a yearbook, we have to do it. We have to see what to put into the book and what not to put into the book. And this is a very big problem. So one of the things that we did, Vinita and I, we decided that we'll make it a little more democratic, even in selection, for it to become very inclusive. So we invited other people like you, who are kind of well versed in the idea of how to define poetry. So, and yet it's not limited to you as an individual. It could be 10 individuals in the game of selection. But we do need help, don't you think, Vinita, in the context of trying to sift poetry from non-poetry? Would you have anything to say about the criteria?
I'd love to hear what Ranjit has to say about sifting poetry from non-poetry. It's absolutely essential. Yes.
Well, in the first place, I think it was a marvelous idea that you expanded your editorial authority to include a collegium of people making these selections, which really allowed, I think, for diverse perspectives. But to answer the question, I'm really not sure where the border is between poetry and non-poetry, at least partly because we're very aware of the experiments of, say, the Dadaists or the Surrealists who produced poetry out of what looks like non-poetry. And how does one achieve those results? So I think we're then in a domain of artisanal thinking about how poets actually craft their poems. So even if it's, how do you make a poem out of a menu or found material or some text that comes your way or something you overhear and mishear, I think then one is looking for an intensity of engagement with the material, with a linguistic vigor, with an ability to experiment. It's so many different things. I mean, in some cases, you marvel at a person's ability to handle classical meter. In another case, you're blown away by the experimental reach and range of a poet. In some cases, you're really dwelling on how material, myths, stories, turns of phrase have been brought across from another language. So I don't think we can have a fixed set of criteria anymore. I think, to me, certainly when I'm reading for the yearbook, I was looking out for moments when I was transported into some kind of wonderment, or when there was an aha moment, when you suddenly see that something interesting has happened. There's a surprise. There's a way in which language has been turned against itself, or deep affect has been articulated in some way that completely gets beyond cliche. So for me, it's all very artisanal. My criteria are not any longer you know, tight classical criteria. No, they're not a priori. I don't start with a set of criteria to which I expect a poem to correspond. I'm just interested in what poems do by themselves, and if that's persuasive.
That's very well said, Ranjit. And coming to the next genre of the questions, I think that we'd really like to address this conversation too. You've had enough exposure in reading poets, international poets, as well as Indian poets. And what strikes you and what distinguishes Indian English poetry, not Indian English poetry, but Indian poetry in English, Anglophone poetry, from the kind of poetry that is being written internationally by other poets writing in English?
That's really a difficult one because our own spectrum of Anglophone poets in India is, first place, they're not all in India, as your own yearbook, our own yearbook proves. So there's a variety of tonalities. I think there's, on the one extreme, are Anglophone Indian poets who are working with something that might be more of an American manner. On the other hand, there might be others who are working in much greater proximity to tonalities that come from their regional linguistic environment. So I don't know that there's a single tonality anymore. But by and large, my sense is that many of the poems in the yearbook are, how shall I put it? They don't settle for irony. They don't settle for forms of distance from the world. I find continuous affect a kind of unalienated link to sensuous experience. I'm not saying this doesn't happen in poems that emanate from other places, but I think this is what kept recurring in the poems that I read. That's it doesn't seem like a very substantial sort of response, but this is what I felt. It wasn't about belonging within a particular country. I think it came much more from grounds of, I don't have another word for it, bhava, some kind of bhava that I felt again and again.
I think it's very important to also, see this point about how, and I'm very sort of fond of looking at this from that perspective, which is the kind of tool of English that gets used here. For a long time, there was this question of looking at models from the West, because by the sheer fact that we were writing in English, and therefore English is very important for us. But I think there has been a very healthy trend today. And as you rightly pointed out about Parthasati and when he uses the term forked tongue, and I think from that consciousness to today's owning of English language, there has been a kind of a journey that we have. There is an arrival point. In a way, there is an arrival point for new journeys to happen. And that is what I felt when I was reading poems from, all the ones that were submitted for the year. Because it seemed as though there was a certain freedom with the tool, and the tool of language, that is, the kind of English that is being used. There's a certain kind of owning. You have vocabulary coming from Indian languages into Indian writing in English. You have something to say about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, now for many years, maybe even 25 to 30 years, I mean, we've shifted from speaking about an English with a capital E to speaking of Englishes in lowercase, even in academic context, as of course you well know.
Yes.
And I think that's true. I think the whole, the older idea of working in an English that somehow existed in an imperial vacuum, that isn't even true of England, for God's sake. I mean, there's hardly a single English in England. So much less all the rest of the world where English is spoken. And there is, as you say, a much more confident sense of being part of this larger ecumeny of people who use English, speak it, read it, are at home in it. And that's a huge shift. I think that sense of a certain colonial, post-colonial anxiety has vanished. Because also these uses of language are no longer confined to a society. It's much more generational. When I hear millennials or people younger, they are using language in the same way as their counterparts elsewhere. That's much more their virtual community. So we are now, I think, redeemed from this prescriptive sense of how to do English in some sense. But I think that's one kind of embrace of a certain kind of transnational English. On the other hand, as you said also, there's a confidence in dealing with the other languages that you have at hand. How do you import them into the English you write? How are your own turns of phrase transformed? What's the body of metaphor that you bring in? I think there was a time when we also had this, I think, largely academic discussion about, we don't really have a patois. How do we deal with this? Why are we different from the Caribbean? I think we many years were wasted in wondering why we had linguistic deficits. But I think we're past that now. I think now there are linguistic advantages, and people are seamlessly practicing them there, which is a huge difference.
Yeah. I'm very intrigued with the kind of bilingualism that we are functioning in, because inherently we are bilingual out here. Well, not only inherently, but quite overtly, right? Because the moment we get out of, we cut off our desks, the moment we get out of the room, out of the study, we have to use another tongue. And there is a very healthy interaction between the two tongues then. And I think that is showing itself very prominently in our creative literature, which is what I really marvel at. I am wondering, and I want to ask you this question. The fact that I know you've been translating, I've been, there are a lot of wow moments that I experienced when I read your Lalla book, for instance, So there were two languages and two sensibilities coming together. And I would not I'm not laughing at the idea of hybridity now, the way I could laugh, say, about 30 years ago at hybridity. Today, it is a healthy trend. So do you whatever you do, for instance, I know that you are engaged in translating perhaps me these days. Am I right?
Yes.
So if you're doing that, are you conscious of what are your takeaways from that Urdu that you are making into your English writing?
Yes.
I'm not just talking about English in general, but your creative writing.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And for me, again, I mean, the term that I have now used more than any other is confluentiality, which I think, for one thing, it gets you away from, I mean, Homi Bhabha's use of hybridity, taking from Bakhtin, was very impressive and important in its own time. But I feel that it tends to remain within the ethos of the contact zone and within a certain kind of colonial history, whilst confluentiality allows you to think in terms of different kinds of dissimilar energies coming together, not only in a colonial scenario, but also, as we know from history, in a paracolonial space. And this was our pre-colonial history anyway, the multiplicity of tongues. We were all, I mean, there is no concept of a mother tongue before Orientalist philology arrives in India, because we didn't need the concept. I've said this many times, so I'll say it again.
I know.
All terms that mean mother tongue in any Indian language are calques of Muttersprache. There's no term Matrabhasha, Madhuri Zaban. These words don't exist in any Indian language before philology arrives, because it was meaningless. You spoke many languages, and you often wrote in your father's language or in the court language. You didn't use the mother tongue, such as it was very much used in domestic space and family contexts. It wasn't used to write poetry and so on and so forth. Or if you used something like Braj that had, it doesn't fit easily into these notions of an outside and an inside language. But that's another story. But how this has helped me along is truly because I feel that translation is a key element of my practice as a poet. I don't see it as something I do in addition to my poetry. And so I've, over the years, really been reshaped, I think, by what I do as a translator, particularly now in working on the Mir translations. I've been fascinated by Urdu syntax. I mean, everything it allows in terms of shading, in terms of leaving the subject of a sentence in brackets, certain forms of opacity that are produced. I mean, many marvelous things, which, again, as I say, I keep harping on this idea of the artisanal. To me, that's crucial. And I think it's come into my poetry now, increasingly. I think the absence of punctuation, the possibility of sentences working in multiple ways, even syntactically. Yeah, it's a very different understanding of translation to the one I had when I started to translate many, many years ago in the early 90s. I began when I was still doing my MA. So at that point, translation theory was very, very powerful. But over the years, you realize that a lot of translation theory misses the point. And it's when you're
in any case, it's always in the making.
It's always in the making. Exactly. Yes. So almost more than any other practice, I think translation theory can only emerge post facto, post your practice.
Totally.
Ranjit, Vinita. Yes. We were discussing, Ranjit mentioned the diversity of poems in the yearbook. And Sukrita, you mentioned the voices and languages, and I'd also like to bring in the multilinguality that we were focusing on right now. So, Ranjit, is it possible to predict a trend in Anglophone poetry based on these, on these criteria? And of course, the artisanal element, like you've been talking about, is absolutely essential, and one can never predict anything on that. But as a trend, where is Indian English poetry going? Where is Indian poetry in English going? Keep picking on this.
Okay, 2 or 3 things about this. One is that there's no single dominant trend, which is a good thing. I think that too often, not only in our literary scene here, but everywhere, there's been too much of a preoccupation with what is the dominant trend. I think we are in a good place in the subcontinent to actually have multiple trends going, because people are responding to hugely different existential situations. So what someone in Srinagar might be writing or what someone in Guwahati is writing, or Shillong, is not going to be identical to what someone's doing in a metropolitan center. Likewise, there's a very different understanding of the world and of geopolitics and of culture if you're south of the Vindhyas. I mean, it was when I was working with the Hindu at some point that I realized that to readers of the Hindu, Sri Lanka and Malaysia were next door. I mean, Sri Lanka literally is next door, but Malaysia, because of the Tamil diaspora, there was a lot of news from Southeast Asia, which, as a reader of the Times of India, the Express in Bombay, this could be another planet. And I think this is what I see also in the poems. People are responding to their key existential urgencies. They're responding to a poetics that they're crafting based on certain exemplars they have. Sometimes it's aspirational. Uh, and to me, that's the strength of Anglophone poetry. And I genuinely think it's hugely vibrant. Maybe because the absence of a single regional context it now seems to be a strength. I mean, there's marvelous writing going on in many other, certainly the couple of other languages that I follow. I know that there's wonderful work in Marathi poetry for sure, Hindi poetry, Gujarati poetry of a certain generation. But what we see now from the Yearbook, for instance, it's very vibrant, it's very lively. So there's no deficit there.
Yeah. Also, when I look at the form, for instance, and both the form as well as the content, it's very clear that there is a certain kind of course, inclusiveness, but this inclusivity and the heterogeneity that we are talking about, is generating a certain kind of aesthetics, which is like, and I really feel like putting my finger on the pulse of that aesthetics, the dynamics of that aesthetics, because there's no stillness there. No. It's really dynamic, and that is the beauty of it.
Yes.
And I think what I am really hankering for right now, as a kind of, when I put on my academic hat, or if I, try and become a critic, then I want it to be streamlined, and that's my problem. It cannot be easily streamlined, and that's the beauty of creativity. However, what I really find interesting and different, and I would like your comments on that, is the kind of process of translation that might be taking place in the act of creativity, right? Because of the multilinguality that we are functioning in. And therein, both in the context of form and the language, something is happening, the intersectionality that is happening. I find it very fascinating. What are your comments on that?
No, I would agree completely. And I think that's earlier on I used this idea of the bhava, but there's something of the evocation of an atmosphere that's not easily translatable. Because just as an exercise, I thought to myself, let me look at some of these poems and what might happen if they were to be translated into other languages. And I was just struck by how many of these poems are in a third space. They're not, they are evidently in English, but they are not bound by the assumptions of what one might link with that language. At the same time, if you try and put them into Hindi, I mean, I tried a couple of other languages. It's not like they disappear into that language. They resist translation.
Tangibly.
Yes. Tangibly, exactly. It's very, very palpable, this resistance.
That's a very interesting observation. That's very, very interesting.
Yes.
So I think that is that being in that third space, or the irreducible space, it's actually a special strength. I mean, of course we can, but they are not easily translatable, and I think that for me is a test. They don't just vanish into another language. So that, like you both were saying earlier, that demonstrates the occupancy of the language and how it's been, many of the poets in the Yearbook have taken ownership of the language. So this is for me, this is proof of that.
Yeah. And interestingly, even if one were to look at Indian poetry happening in other languages, not necessarily English, even they are getting to be very difficult to translate, because there is multilinguality.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
there also you have English coming in, and a Hindi poem may be very anglicized,
true.
or Marathiized, or so that same problem would be there in terms of translatability, and that's the challenge that we have to face now.
As we go along, yes, but it also propels us into this very, very interesting interlingual kind of space. So I've also been looking at some young Marathi poets. It's there's so much there. There's Hindi. It's like, I mean, poet happens to be from Bombay, but there's a lot of Hindi, there's English, there's different kinds of language music that comes into the body of the poet.
Ranjit, I wanted to ask you about this whole issue of self-esteem and pride that Anglophone poets in India are kind of struggling with.
Okay.
So I wanted to actually quote a tweet by Tabish Khair where he mentions he'd gone for a reading, and this was about 2 decades ago. This reading was in London, and I quote his tweet. It says, "When I did a poetry reading in London 2 decades ago, a London poet was congratulated by other UK poets for publishing in 3 major magazines that year. So had I, the same 3, but they knew him and had not noticed me, and they did not know me." So would you say that this is like a one-off experience of a particular poet, or is this a general experience? And I know for a fact that you haven't had this experience because you've read all over the world, and you've done so well for yourself. You're an acclaimed poet all over the world. But what do you say for Indian poets who have these, who struggle with these thoughts and with these issues, if at all?
No, you're very kind, Vinita, to begin with. But I think we've all had some version of this experience, and not always abroad. We've also had it here, and I'll come to that in a moment. I read Tabish's tweet, so I know the tweet. I know what he went through. Part of that has to do with the fact that in any art form, it honestly helps if you're part of that social circle. I mean, and to be there. So I know that 20 years ago already was like the dawn of globalization. So it could be the case that the British poets were also, and in the best sense, I mean, I don't want to rubbish them in any way. That scene has changed vastly too. But I remember 20 or 25 years ago, there was a certain insularity in every literal and figurative sense to the UK scene. This has now been blown wide open, partly because in the first place, they've recognized their own internal diversity. You have far more voices of women, people of other sexual orientation, of other races or interracial people. It's transformed, but I can well imagine what Tavish went through at that time. With me, it was quite another situation where, again, about 20 years ago, the British Council had this tradition of bringing in the British poet who judged calls competition usually did a kind of a tour of it and did workshops and so on. And with every year, we noticed that the poet was getting younger, which is not a bad thing. But it came to a point where it was absurd that they would preside in workshops where many of us would present ourselves as acolytes of some kind. And as that age gap kind of, grew less wide, there came a point where I had to say to the British Council representative, I think it's absurd. I said, if you're going to have a more democratic form, this is fine, because I won't name the poet. But I said, I've been in the same journals as this poet. We're virtually the same age. He was actually younger. And by any cry, and there were a couple of us also who other poets who also had been published by the same UK journals and so on. Says this is now looking like what it is, a reflexive colonialism, where the British Council brings culture from the imperial center to us marginal fools in the peripheries. And the lady from the British Council was, it was like something out of Asimov. Her robotic circuitry just went into fireworks. She didn't understand what I was saying. I simply couldn't understand that the world had changed in this dramatic way. So that bears out what Tabish was saying of that period. Now things are quite different.
Yeah. And also, in fact, it was very interesting around that time that, British Council had to take a decision to move towards translation in India.
Indeed.
And I remember this was wonderful, because they had to learn to accommodate the idea of multilinguality, which was very foreign to them, because they have been till very recently, they were very conscious of their monolinguality and thrusting that monolinguality on, whoever were in the empire that they,
exactly.
And we very easily, I'm probably the senior most from amongst the three of us. And I still remember that point when, it was thrust upon us in such a bad way, and we would buy it. we would buy it very easily. And we wanted to exercise the same norms here. So I think this yearbook is evidence of the fact that we have broken away from all of that.
The tangent has happened.
Yeah.
Yes.
No,
yes.
I think it's true. It really marks exactly this transition that's taken place. Today,
Yes.
the scenes that Tabish described in the tweet or that I just described would be unthinkable. You wouldn't,
Yes.
There's a completely
It won't
different.
happen. Yes.
It wouldn't happen today.
And today, Cole would not organize a poetry competition with, a white man to come in and judge. He would not do it. I remember I've been part of the Poetry Society right from the beginning. And I know that this decision was taken for granted, that it would come from the West. The judge would be from there. And you needed to have, but anyway, those days are gone happily.
Yes,
and
indeed.
Now I think it's time
the
that
time is clear.
Yeah. So
to be fair to Cole, I have to say that he was also working with the systems available and at hand.
Yes.
And just as we did reasonably well out of non-alignment and so on, I think our participation in these global systems also came with certain opportunities and possibilities. But I think it's a tribute to, frankly, us as a nation state, society, that we've overcome these things.
Yeah. And then the last one bit, I would like to just comment on the living mythology that we have even today. And that's, I think, a very distinct feature of probably our poetry and in English, more than any other poetry happening anywhere else in the world.
Yes.
Because there is a kind of a frozen mythology. If you only in an academic class would you sit down and talk about, mythology. But today, a Durga is not going to be exoticized. A Sita is not going to be exoticized. That, the same Durga who was exoticized maybe 25 years ago within the country in English, today she will not be exoticized. So I think there is a difference in our approach to mythology, but it lives anyway, doesn't it?
You're absolutely right. Actually, I just last month wrote an essay called "The Epic is Never Over," which is really I was working on it. It suddenly came to me that the fact is that, as you just said, our mythologies are living mythologies. But forever, we've had this strange framework of looking at it through a way of looking at mythology that comes from Europe. Where Greek myths are over, but here they're not. Our myths are not over. No. So this distinction of mythology, folklore, text, performance, those distinctions actually are meaningless because all of these forms are in a continuous state of interplay.
Yes. I'm so happy that, Vinita, the inconclusiveness of, so many points that we are raising, that's the beauty of it. There is no finality of interpretation or conclusive understanding of what Indian poetry is because there is no homogeneity there. Yeah. And I think it's been wonderful, isn't it, to have this discussion?
It's been a pleasure to be talking to Ranjit and to have his thoughts and so many of these wonderful, these things that we wanted to talk about and have his views on them. And thank you so much, Ranjit, for talking to us and shedding light.
No, it's been very enjoyable for me, and I learned a number of things from both of you. So I'm really happy to have been in this conversation. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.